Here in Canada, meanwhile, as well as the United States, the potential arrival of electric vehicles from China is seen as a major threat, with talks of imposing tariffs and the fear that China will subsidize domestic car makers and then flood the international market. But as we've seen, Australia has forged ahead anyway. And joining us now to talk more about this is Lachlan Bennett, a journalist with the Australia Broadcasting Corporation, speaking with us all the way from Melbourne today. Thanks for making time for us, Lachlan.
Wonderful to be here.
So first of all, why has China allowed these why has Australia allowed these Chinese EVs instead of trying to block them like we've been hearing about elsewhere in the West?
Well, I guess one of the biggest reasons is Australia doesn't really have a massive car industry to protect. For decades, we had Holden, the classic true blue Australian car brand. At its peak, there was about 500,000 sales of Australian cars in the 70s. But in 2017, the last of the manufacturers packed up. So now we're really relying on imported vehicles. And China is really forging ahead when it comes to cheap electronic vehicles, and heaps of them are launching in our country.
Let's backtrack a little bit for some context around these two countries. Australia and China had a bit of a trade war during the pandemic. So how have they arrived in this place now?
Well, during the pandemic, Australia its love-hate relationship with China, which is part of the reason that we have that love-hate relationship, is because Australia really relies on China for exports. It's our biggest trading partner, but there's all these political issues and tensions that simmer away in the background. Things like concerns about territorial ambitions in the South China Sea, 5G technology from China. And this all really came to a head during the pandemic when there were calls for an inquiry into the outbreak of COVID-19. And shortly after that, we saw China put a range of tariffs and trade barriers on a bunch of Australian goods like wine, barley, and timber. And that really hurt a lot of Australian producers who want to get into that Chinese market. But since the change of government in 2022, there's been an opportunity to, I guess, reset relationships between Australia and China. So we're seeing some of those trade barriers and tariffs come off, and a bit more of a willingness and openness to work together. And following on from that, we've seen Chinese car manufacturers really look at Australia as quite a lucrative market. It has a really big, passionate car-loving population. It's got great road infrastructure, and it's a good launching pad for other Western markets.
Okay, so that's kind of the politics of it. Let's take it to the streets, I suppose. What's been the response from Australians? Are these Chinese EVs popular there?
Well, Australians are notoriously early adopters of new technology, and we're really familiar with driving Chinese cars. You know, Japanese brands like Toyota have really dominated our roads for decades. And now that we have all these big Chinese brands coming in, like BYD, Zeekr, GAC coming in, Australians are looking at them and saying, well, maybe it's worth a go. The other big thing to remember is Australia has such a huge multicultural population and a big Asian expat community. So a lot of Chinese migrants might have friends and family who own these vehicles back at home, and when they launch in Australia, they want to give it a go as well. But at the same time, there's been this long-running culture war about electric vehicles in Australia. The former Prime Minister famously said in 2019 that a plan to boost sales to 50% of new vehicle sales by 2030 would end the weekend because these electric vehicles couldn't tow boats or take Australians on these big outback camping trips that we love so much. But some of these Chinese new competitors coming in are offering these very cheap SUV cars that have hundreds of kilometres of range. So Australians are really voting with their feet.
Fascinating stuff. Thank you so much for your time today. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
That's Lachlan Bennett, a journalist with the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, joining us from Melbourne.